Welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. We're really grateful for the opportunity, and we're going to have a wonderful conversation. You're going to be multitasking, right? Which for many of you is something that's quite normal. But we are aware that at some point you're going to be looking at your phones and writing questions, and we're not going to think you're rude for doing that. But please don't, be watching YouTube. Okay, we're going to get started. We have several questions that we're going to talk through together. First, I'd really like you to share what brings you to this conversation. If you could tell us about why the complex subject of pluralism, immigration, and religious difference is one that you care about.
Yes, so well, first of all, thank you so much for having us. It's really wonderful to be here. It's wonderful, particularly to see Christian and Muslim organizations coming together to cultivate these kinds of conversations. This started for me when I was a college student. 9/11 happened. I was a political science major, junior in college, and studying political science from a rather distant position. 9/11 really brought religion to the forefront in terms of discussions about politics and international relations. And as a Christian myself, that forced me to really wrestle with a lot of questions as far as how I thought about my faith and how I thought about politics. Another key moment for me was after graduating from college, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan had commenced, and I took part in a Christian missions and service organization that took me to Eastern Europe to serve in a refugee camp. Refugees from Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran were streaming into Europe, and they were being captured along the eastern border and put in a variety of refugee camps. And I was serving for a summer after college, teaching English to refugees coming in. And of course, teaching English, really, it was relationship building. And so I spent a lot of time listening to some pretty heartbreaking and difficult stories of young people who had made their way by land, foot, truck, train from Afghanistan trying to get into Europe. And a whole summer of stories for a white kid from the suburbs. That was a really impactful thing for me. So trying to reflect on how my own faith could make sense of the suffering that they had experienced, and that my country had played some role in that, a significant role in that, and trying to reflect on what that meant for me as a Christian, as a citizen of the United States. So all of those questions were bubbling in me as I was young. And then later on, I was really interested in Christian political ethics and discussions about religious freedom, and was interested in writing on these topics. And the thing is, when you read Christian theory on religious freedom, it often has to do with defending Christian religious freedom. Christians, it turns out, are very good at defending themselves. We're not terribly well practiced at defending other people's religious freedom. And so that was a topic that became really interesting to me, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on tonight. But I was wrestling with that question. It's quite easy to defend one's own religious freedom and dignity and institutions, but it's quite another to try to defend a faith that you don't hold. And so that's been a core driving question for me.
Great, thank you. Shadi, how about you?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's my first time in Minnesota, so this is a new experience for me. Interestingly, 9/11 was also very central to my story. So it was freshman year. I just started at Georgetown. So here I am. I'm living away from home for the first time in my life. I don't know what to expect. I'm trying to define my identity and figure out who I am and who I want to be. A couple weeks into my time, 9/11 happens. And in some sense, it was a double tragedy for me as an American, of course, but also as a Muslim. And I had to sort of process or try to understand how it could possibly be that people who claim to be of my faith could commit these atrocities in the name of my religion. So I had to, that was confusing to me. So that politicized me. So I start college and I'm not thinking about going into politics or policy. 9/11 gets me more and more interested in these issues, and then the Iraq War happened. So for our generation, a lot of things happened at around the same time. 9/11, Afghanistan War, Iraq War, the Bush era, and it's interesting because we have a new generation of college students who, many of whom were born after 9/11 or right around the time. So things have really changed in that respect. But so that really, that was the first set of turning points for me. And then maybe I'll just fast forward a little bit. I started conducting research in the Middle East in the late 2000s for my PhD. And I was really, I was looking at certain Islamist movements and Islamist parties like the Muslim Brotherhood. The Arab Spring happens a little bit later than that. And the Arab Spring is really key for me because I was there in Tahrir Square the day that Mubarak fell. So February 11th, 2011, the Egyptian revolution is happening. Many of you might remember the 24-hour coverage and the excitement that a lot of Americans felt about the Middle East. And, I think as Americans, we don't get excited about anything in the Middle East because it's always very depressing. But here it was, people actually protesting for freedom and for dignity. And I was there in the square when it was announced that Mubarak, the longtime dictator of 30 years, would be stepping down. And it was such a beautiful moment. I mean, it's actually a rather rare thing to be in the midst of a revolution. We study revolutions in our political science classes in grad school, but to actually be in the middle of one is really quite literally a once-in-a-lifetime experience. That was a beautiful moment, but I was living in the Middle East at the time, and I see this rise and fall, because we fast forward a couple of years, 2013, 2014, the Arab Spring becomes an Arab winter. Things go very, very downhill. Military coups, civil wars, counter-revolution, you name it. And in Egypt, specifically, so I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania, but originally my parents are from Egypt. What I saw in Egypt, the failure of democracy and the democratic transition there had quite a lot to do with religious differences. So you had people who disagreed fundamentally about the role of religion in public life, and they ultimately came to blows, and there was a massacre. There's a lot that can be said about what happened in Egypt, but the more time that I spent living in the Middle East, the more I couldn't escape a basic realization that religion matters a lot. And I wanted to, as an American and as an academic, I felt it was important to take religion more seriously, because I think for those of us who grow up in more secular environments in the US, especially around major urban centers, New York, Washington, D.C., outside of Philly, whatever it is, religion seems a little bit quaint, right? And I even remember growing up, I don't really remember serious religious Christians. I only started meeting serious Christians who weren't just nominal, but believers, theological Christians, until later in life. And one of those friends is Matthew Kaemingk. But it's weird to think that you live in a Christian majority country and the encounter with Christianity isn't something that you actually experience all that much. So as I got older and as I spent more time in the Middle East, I came back to the US, I'm thinking more and more about these fundamental questions of why do we do what we do, what forms our identity, and the fact that we don't always take religion as seriously as we should, either as a source of division, but also as a source of coming together and understanding. And we'll talk about what that can look like.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that friendship as well, that's built for us has been a really interesting thing. This is the fourth or fifth conversation that Shadi and I have done together, and I'm excited to talk about that as well, because that's been a meaningful part, not simply as scholars, but as friends. And it's an important part of growing as a person, as a citizen, and it's impacted my scholarship as well. So we'll talk about that.
Great. You have a lot to look forward to already. So I want to start maybe with some terminology so we can maybe decomplicate some things that get put into these kinds of conversations. Could you talk about what is religious pluralism? And you may need to talk about what it's not.
You want to start this one, Shadi?
Well, you wrote the book on it.
Let's start with what's not. Okay, so religious pluralism takes difference really, really seriously. That's what's core. Is it doesn't try to cover over difference with nice talk. There's not sort of this dreamy picture that we're all going to hold hands and agree at the end of the conversation. We're not all going to sing Kumbaya. It's also not any kind of search for peace through assimilation. So we're going to have peace if you become like me or if I become like you. That it doesn't see difference as a problem that needs to be solved at this table, right? Difference is something we get to explore and talk about, but the point of this conversation is not to erase the difference between us, but actually to take that difference seriously. So it's not a call for assimilation. And that's really core. And so what we talk about a lot with the Center for Public Justice is this idea of principled pluralism. And there's two basic rules for principled pluralism. The first is that you take one another's principles seriously, and you don't try to destroy those principles. But also that you are free to hold to your principles in a deep way. So there's those two things, this active generosity for other people's pluralism, for other people's principles, but also out of your own convictions. So I am hospitable to my friend Shadi because of my core conviction about who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for me. I am a Christian. And my Christian convictions don't cause me to want to assimilate him into me or force him to agree with me. But because of my relationship with Jesus, I feel compelled to make space for him in America as a citizen. And so my pluralism, my tolerance, doesn't come from a place of nowhere. It actually comes from my Christian faith. So in order to be a good democratic citizen, I don't have to sort of put my Christianity to the side, but live it.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on that, for me to uphold pluralistic ideas means that I can and should have a deep respect for Matt's conviction in Christ. I don't want him to dilute that or soften that. And it means too that I don't have to have some interfaith opening prayer at a dinner. Like if you're with people who believe in what they believe, that you respect that they're going to be fully true to that. You don't ask them for this kind of meeting halfway, which dilutes both faiths. So that, but maybe I'll just also add an anecdote is, and this I come back to this story a lot because it really crystallized something that bothers me. But basically, you might remember this in, I think it was 2014 or 2015 on the Bill Maher show. They were having a debate about Islam with Ben Affleck, the actor who you all probably know, and the host Bill Maher, and the new atheist philosopher Sam Harris. And Sam Harris and Bill Maher are saying things that are not too friendly towards Islam. And Ben Affleck comes to the defense of Muslims, to our defense, and that was at a time when I wasn't used to seeing Muslims and Islam defended on national television. It happens all the time now because we've become more mainstream and part of the cultural discussion and all that. But in 2014, that was still relatively rare. And here's Ben Affleck, one of the most famous actors. He says something like, Muslim, basically on the lines of, Muslims are just like us. They want to raise their kids and live good lives. And he said, literally, he said, Muslims like to eat sandwiches too. And I thought to myself, well, yes, I can verify we do like sandwiches. But something about it, and I was happy on one hand that he was defending us, but on the other hand, something about it it didn't make me feel good. It felt like this lowest common denominator approach to difference, that we really have to talk about things that, of course, that are really basic. Why?
It was really what it was is Muslims are okay because they're like us.
Exactly. But why can't Muslims be okay even if they're not like us? What if Muslims are different in different ways? And what if Christians are different in different ways? Why do we have to paper over that and almost kind of pretend that it doesn't exist? And I think that in America today, we have this fear of difference. We're uncomfortable talking about how we can actually believe in fundamental different assumptions about life and the way that we live. And there's almost like this sort of liberal faith that this universal sameness, that if everyone has the right information from the right sources, we'll all come to the same rational conclusions. But what that doesn't take seriously is that we humans have different values. And I think over time, I've started to appreciate more that the most interesting and useful and beneficial conversations that I'm a part of is when I see the other person's difference and we talk about it. And I've learned, for example, from Matt, a lot about how Christians view Christ. And I think that sometimes I have, Muslim friends or colleagues who kind of don't take that seriously enough, that there are deep theological premises there. And I don't have to believe in it or agree with it. By definition, I can't because I'm Muslim. But that doesn't mean that we can't respect it and appreciate it and learn from it. And the more that I've learned about how Matt understands Christ in his own life and how that informs his views around tolerance and pluralism, I'm like, this is some pretty great stuff. And I like hearing about it and I like learning about it.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we've got the terms down. Let's kind of use that new understanding maybe of pluralism.
Shadi has to go first this time.
Okay, I'll make him go first. Let's turn to the issue of Muslim immigration, right? You've touched on this a little bit, but the public debate about immigration is animated, it's stoked by fear. There's a lot of anxiety, and there's certainly a lot of inflammatory language out there. Could you talk a little bit about what the conditions are for genuine encounter and mutual exchange with Islamic refugee and immigrant cultures? And could you talk about the theological and religious resources that bear on this question, both within Christianity and Islam?
Yeah, sure. So there's a big problem now, and we see it a lot in Europe and to a lesser extent here in the US, where the increase in the refugee population, specifically from the Syrian civil war, going into various European countries, has contributed to a lot of tension, and unfortunately, it's contributed to the rise of right-wing populist parties. And so the 2015 refugee crisis is very critical for Europe in this regard. You take Germany, for example, where they accepted somewhere close to 1 million refugees, most of them from Syria, and the vast majority of them Muslim, including from other Muslim majority countries facing conflict and civil war. So it has led to a lot of questions about the place of Islam in Western democracy. And for countries, especially in Europe, that are more homogenous and less diverse than, say, we are in America, and they don't really have this culture of immigrants come, where I guess, at least in theory, I think many Americans still acknowledge that we're a country of immigrants. And even I think, believe it or not, it's really interesting to think about that even the First Lady is an immigrant. And the president's mom was an immigrant. So even if we talk about anti-immigrant ideas coming from Donald Trump and the Republican Party, still, they're Marco Rubio, a child of immigrants, Ted Cruz, so on and so forth. So I think that most people would acknowledge this as important. In Europe, not as much. And then there becomes this question about Muslims seem to be more religious, more observant in countries like France or Germany, where there aren't that many serious Christians anymore. Most people have become secular, Levels of atheism are quite high. To take France as an example, around 55% of French Muslims say that religion is very important in their daily life. For the rest of the population, the number is around 10%. So then there comes this question, if Muslims aren't really getting on board with secularism in a Western context, can they really belong? And how do we deal with that kind of difference? And if women, and I'm sure, Matt, you'll want to say something about this too, because you've written a great article about it, but if women are wearing the headscarf in a very secular society like in France, that really seems like a weird, foreign, bizarre thing, and you can't really be fully French if you wear the hijab because French culture sees you as, oh, you're not secular enough, you're backwards, you're part of this old religious culture. So in Western democracy, the role of Islam, even though Muslims are a fairly small percentage, so in France about 7 or 8%, in other European countries between 1 and 5%. So we're not talking about massive numbers, but because they seem different and because many Europeans have trouble with difference, we have a bit of a crisis. And so that's why this is very important, and conversations like this are vital, because this will be a really important test for Western democracies going forward, is how do we deal with the other? If Muslims are the other, do we want to force them to become secular? Do we say that, oh, you have to give up your religion? Or do we say, you can become French and keep your traditions? You can become French and keep your religious practice instead of having to choose between one or the other?
So it really comes down to this discussion of difference, right? And with globalization, difference is coming at us quickly. This difference is deep, and it's very close to us. And so we're having to navigate, as citizens in the West, difference at a very rapid rate. And so that calls on us as citizens to ask ourselves, what resources do we have to sit down at a table next to a Republican or a Democrat, or next to someone of a different skin color or a different religion or a different sexual orientation? Can we sit with this deep difference? Do we have resources to make space for that? And the thing about democracy, or liberal democracy, is that it does not produce in and of itself resources to hold us together. So the United States of America has the financial resources to support hundreds of thousands of refugees, right? We have the financial resources to do something like this. But do we have the spiritual and cultural resources necessary to make space? That's the deeper question. And it's one that's happening in Western Europe with the rise of populism, is this sense of citizens are running out of reasons to make space for difference. And they've just said, we don't want it. That Muslims either need to go home or they need to assimilate. And those are the only two options, because we want no space. We can't handle this kind of space. Because you have this, in cities like Amsterdam and Paris and Berlin, you have deep cultural, racial, religious, and economic differences living on top of one another. And there are just increasingly European citizens who just say no. We want Germany for Germans, and we want France for the French. And they have a very specific idea of what they mean by that. And so we're seeing this growth of right-wing populism, first in Europe and now increasingly here. So the question for democracy is really, where do you get those resources? And so Christians are having to wrestle with that. Do we, as Christians, have resources to make space for difference? Muslims are wrestling with that. Jews are wrestling with that. But most importantly, secular liberals are having to wrestle with that and ask themselves, do we have resources within secular humanism and to make space for this and to make sense of these religious others? So it's a massive question.
And just to give an example on this, because it does go, as Matt is alluding to, well beyond questions of religion. So some of my friends on the left, and I consider myself to be on the left. I generally vote Democrat and all that stuff, right? So and being in D.C., most of the people I know are pretty liberal. But the way sometimes people talk about Trump supporters or Republicans, it's not just from their standpoint that Republicans or Trump supporters are wrong, which is fine. People can be wrong in democracy. It's that there's something fundamentally immoral and deficient about them. They are bad people. They are, even in some sense, if not evil themselves, supporting evil. And that arguments that basically Trump supporters by definition are racist because they support a racist. So I think that that's become a whole debate on its own, and I think it's unfortunate because if Trump has, and it's gone up since impeachment, it's gone like from 40% to 49% approval rating for Trump since impeachment, that's where we're at. So to think that 40% plus of our fellow American citizens are evil or bad or irredeemable, that is also a conversation we have to have about saying, well, we can disagree profoundly as Americans. And I think that the things that you support are really, really bad. But that doesn't mean that you are beyond the pale. Because once we start thinking that way, then we're done as a country. Because then what do we share as Americans? And there are two parties, so generally a big chunk of the population will support the other party. So these are things that we have to kind of keep in mind in our own lives, even if you put aside the Muslim and Islam issue. And one thing that worries me too that's related to this is that the Democratic Party is becoming less accepting of people of religious faith. So for example, if you want to vote Democrat and you basically agree with Democrats on most things, but you're pro-life, or you don't support, or you're not fully enthusiastic about gay marriage, then you're automatically seen as, oh, that person can't really be part of our coalition. That's not a real Democrat because they still have conservative religious convictions that they should go and be with the Republicans. And I think that we have to be careful about that, because when I was growing up, I remember that Democrats were still trying to reach out to people of faith. Obama used to talk about that a lot. I don't hear Democrats talk so much about that anymore. And if we're becoming stratified where one party has most of the people of faith and the other party has mostly secular people who are not particularly religious, then you get into this kind of scary territory that we're just becoming more and more separate from each other.
Okay, Shadi.
Absolutely.
All right, Shadi, but part of the question was about Islam's resources for dealing with this. Could you tell us just a little bit, as a Muslim, how you enter into these kinds of conversations and you think about what resources you find within Islam to help you navigate this difference or this contingency?
Yeah, sure. Well, so it's your work, Matt, that has thought. So Matt introduced me through his book and through our friendship, as we've talked over the past couple of years, this idea of Christian pluralism. And I hadn't really thought much about what I would consider to be Islamic pluralism. I knew that there were different components, but that's not really a phrase. And even Christian pluralism isn't a very well-known phrase either. The idea, and Matt, you can feel free to talk more about how you view Christian pluralism, but as a Muslim, I found this really fascinating. The short version, as far to the best of my ability of what Christian pluralism is this idea that we are all broken by sin. We are fallen from sin. And that brokenness in this life and in this world means that we have to be humble about the level of truth and certainty we can attain in this world. That perfection...
Just a second. All the Christians, did he do a good job of describing sin there? Yeah? Okay. Good job.
Yeah.
Keep going.
But that also...
So the sin.
Yeah, that also Christ is central to this in the sense that perfection is only possible with and through Christ. And until Christ's return, there is this uncertainty that is endemic to our own existence here as fallen human beings. What that means is that if perfection isn't possible here and it's only possible in the next life, then that means that politics is about making at least some compromises. It's about understanding rather than forcing one particular view on the other. So this idea of Christian pluralism that Matt has written a lot about in his own work, first of all, I love the idea of being broken by sin and how that leads to a kind of epistemological humility, because we need that. That truth is something that is not, it's a little bit out of reach. We can seek truth, and God encourages us and asks us to search and seek the truth, but that doesn't mean we can always find it. So I thought, like, what is the corollary of that in the Islamic context? And there's a couple examples, I just mentioned them quickly. So in the kind of medieval era, but people still do it to some extent even now, you've probably heard the word fatwa, which is a religious edict. It usually has a negative connotation in American public discourse because bad people give bad fatwas, so on and so forth. But fatwas can also include good things because they're just religious edicts, so whatever. But anyway, it was a tradition and something that every scholar of Islamic law would do, and every imam would do if they were giving a fatwa. They would have a very strong opinion, but then they would have a final sentence at the very end, Allahu A'lam in Arabic, which means only God knows. And the reason they emphasize this at the end of every religious edict, they were essentially declaring their humility, that they tried their best in this fatwa. They brought all the knowledge they possibly could to bear, but at the end of the day, with all their learning and scholarship, there is only one source that has full knowledge, and that source is God. So they're acknowledging that they could basically be wrong. Another example is there's a prophetic hadith, or saying of the Prophet Muhammad, that so mujtahid is someone who tries to basically interpret Islam and Islamic law. So if one interpreter or mujtahid seeks the truth and gets it right, he gets 2 good deeds. If the other mujtahid or interpreter tries to seek God's truth but gets it wrong, he gets 1 good deed. So both of them are rewarded by God. So in other words, the basic idea here is that if you're right, great, you'll get, that's still kind of better. But even if you get it wrong, as long as your intention is sincere and you're operating in good faith, if you will, God still rewards you. So this shows that there can't, in some sense, there isn't one right answer. Obviously on creedal matters that are fundamental, Muslim scholars agree on the basics, otherwise you wouldn't have a religion. But on things that aren't the foundation, that's where there's a deep pluralism that's there in the tradition of Islamic law. And many of you might know that there are 4 major schools of Islamic law, which again is sort of a sign of how this pluralism evolved legally. But do you want to add? But how Christian pluralism? Do you want to say something more about it?
Let me interrupt you and ask you a question, because I think one thing that's happened here that's important just to name is that part of what is the work that both of you have devoted yourselves to is something that is replicable, right? There's a commitment to religious literacy here, right? One part of that is knowing oneself and what oneself believes, right? The other part is knowing what someone who is not like me believes. I mean, Shadi was able to talk about sin in a way that Christians in the room were like, yes, that's what we mean when we say this. I think those pieces are incredibly important before one gets to, okay, what can we do together? How do we protect one another? Or how do we even move from kind of what I would almost say is a lowest common denominator of sort of coexistence to something like civic friendship? I mean, how do we do that work besides just sort of like knowing one's own and knowing the other? How do we move to civic friendship?
Yeah. So I'll talk about it on sort of a micro level and then a more macro level. So on the micro level, Shadi comes to me with questions instead of pronouncements about Christianity. So he had taken the time to read the book of Galatians, a book in the New Testament, and came to me with some questions about it, and truly wanted to understand and understand a core part of the book of Galatians is the concept of grace. And so we were wrestling with that, and he came with genuine questions and was honest with that, and he wanted to honor the text by trying to understand it. And that, as a posture, was, he came with a posture of humility and love and honor, and that's something I feel like I need to reciprocate as well. Sort of a micro-level friendship. That was an incredibly meaningful encounter to me, and I think he was just genuinely curious. But for me, it was a really powerful and honoring thing that he would come with questions about, my book. On a macro level, in terms of civic friendship, so my research has been focused a lot on the rise of Islamophobia in Europe, and specifically in the Netherlands, and a lot of the fights that have happened in the Netherlands over Muslim immigration. And one interesting fight that went on in the Netherlands a number of years ago was there were some far left-wing animal rights activists who had decided that both halal and kosher butcher practices were cruel to animals. And so they wanted to ban, in the Netherlands, all halal and kosher butchers. And what happened in response was quite fascinating, was a group of Muslims, a group of Jews, and a group of Christians all came together in that civic moment to defend one another. It's not often that you see Muslims, Jews, and Christians coming together, but here it was a group of animal rights activists that helped them come together. So it was kind of interesting. So it seems to me that with this rise of globalization, yes, there's going to be increased clashes, but there are also going to be some really fascinating moments of collaboration. And I think, as I speak to my own Christian community here in the United States, a great deal of my fellow evangelical Christians still have this dream of taking the country back and making it a Christian nation. And it seems to me that evangelical Christians in Europe have a minority status, and they know what it is to be a strange community in a much larger secular culture. And there are these points at which Muslims and evangelicals in Europe can actually understand each other in deeper ways than their more secular fellow citizens, in really fascinating ways. So one last thing.
Yeah.
I met with a group of Christian women in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands who had formed this sewing group with a group of Muslim women. And they would sew together, and as they sewed, as you do, I guess you talk. And so they'd sew around the table, and they found as they sewed, they would talk about their children, they would talk about their husbands, they would talk about the city, but they would even begin to find themselves discussing Dutch secular progressive culture. They would find that they were both quite uncomfortable with the materialism of the West, conservative Christians and more conservative Muslims. They found that they were very concerned about raising their children in the faith, and they had anxiety about that in the secular culture. They found that they were very nervous about the sexualization of their daughters, and wrestling with those questions together. And so one of the things that gives me hope is these interesting moments of connection that they didn't expect. So I've been reflecting on that sewing group quite a bit.
I was with a campus ministry staff person who works for a Christian parachurch ministry organization on a secular campus recently. And she was sharing that many of the Muslim immigrant women students come to the Christian Fellowship's weekly gatherings because they're more comfortable in the relationships there than they are with the secular students on their campus. That actually has been a place of much more hospitality with shared perspectives on the world in terms of...
Which is very strange and counterintuitive, because of course we have to name that if you're looking for the most Islamophobic demographic in the United States, I'm a white, male, conservative evangelical, right? So it is counterintuitive. We have to name that. But these interesting points of connection are fascinating to me.
Yep. You've been wonderful putting your questions in here. Keep going. I'm going to turn to some of these questions because they're great. Could you, both of you, and you can decide who wants to start, say a little bit more about the role of evangelism within each of your traditions, and how it relates to the idea of principled pluralism or deep difference? Coin toss.
You want to start?
Well, I'm the evangelical. Well, I think it's core to our identity as Christians. Telling the story of what happened at the tomb of Jesus' resurrection is core to what it means to be a Christian. What I would say is that the core command that Jesus gives us is to love our neighbor. And that means to be just to them. That means to be kind to them. That means to be generous and hospitable to them. But it also means to share our story with them, to witness. And so, part of my relationship with Shadi is very aware that I'm passionate about my faith, and I'm going to tell him what my faith means to me. And I don't think that bothers Shadi at all. He expects it. I think if I didn't, he would be offended because, well, you can tell him. I'm not going to speak for Shadi anymore, but yeah, of course, telling what Jesus has meant to me in my life is core to who I am. And if you ask me not to do that, that's, well.
Can you relate it to the idea of principled pluralism?
Oh, yes, principled pluralism. Principled pluralism, as we said, it doesn't mean ignoring differences. We can talk about it. Within principled pluralism, you can have deep disagreements. In fact, that's part of what makes democracy healthy, is actually that active contestation as well, practicing that. What's very deadly for democracy is the suppression of difference, because then things start to bubble up, and then they bust out people in really violent ways or aggressive ways. And so part of practicing democracy is telling our story to one another. So we use this word evangelism, and it's this sort of scary word, but I would also say that there are secular liberals who engage in forms of evangelism every day. They make arguments for their worldview every day as well. So I think the term itself needs to be deconstructed a bit as well. I think in a democracy, everyone is engaging in evangelism in that sense.
Yeah, so it's interesting for me, and because I'm Muslim, but I'm not evangelical in the kind of small e sense, that I actually, I maybe growing up or something, when I was, a little bit more conservative, I thought about this sometimes, but I don't like the idea personally of Muslims going out and trying to convert people. But that said, I know many Muslims who feel that that's important, and I think then it becomes a question of style and how you do it. And there are some kinds of proselytization that everyone should stay away from, which are really the aggressive kind. You sort of probably know what I'm talking about. You've seen people who use this aggressive approach. I would also say I don't like it when I'm not comfortable when my fellow Muslims will tell a Christian, hey, by the way, you're wrong about Jesus. And Jesus actually, was just a prophet, and here's why, according to your scripture. And then this Muslim person will come up with passages from the New Testament. So sort of like Muslim-splaining to a Christian about what their book says about their religion. Because I don't want Christians to do that to me. I wouldn't want a Christian to come and say, hey, Muslim person, Shadi, here, you're wrong about your own book. The Quran actually says X, Y, and Z. You don't realize it. That's the stuff that all of us, I would hope, can agree to avoid. But I still have to say, this is probably evidence of my own, the fact that I have become somewhat secularized, that I have become uncomfortable with proselytization. So I guess that in some sense I'm a product of my own secular context. But I agree 100% with Matt. I would never want Matt to soft pedal his beliefs. I wouldn't want him to be like, hey Shadi, by the way, you believe in a false prophet. That's not what we're talking about here. That wouldn't fit into principled pluralism. But if I can feel and sense the passion that he has for his belief in Christ and what that means to him, there's no reason that I should feel bothered or threatened by it, because he is just sharing what he believes to be true, and all of us should feel that we can share what we believe to be true with the people that we care about in our lives. And if we can't do that, then we're doing precisely what Matt said. We're suppressing who we are. And I don't believe that people should suppress who they are in a free democratic society.
So there's something implicit in this conversation that I want to just make explicit. You are talking not just on you used micro and macro earlier, the civic friendship as relationship. You're not just on that level. You're actually also talking about the work of government in protecting the space for you to make different truth claims, and not deciding that one of you is right and one of you is wrong, which actually makes you more free to be able to say, I believe this is the truth. So it gives generativeness to the resources that you actually bring from your own traditions to say, I'm willing to extend this hospitality to you and not use the force of government to suppress you. And we will be who we truly are rather than kind of the lowest common denominator, plain vanilla, right? That makes folks who are quite animated by evangelism more free to make their case for the truth. And do it in a way that is not offensive and decrying other people, but in a way that reflects the very nature of the faith, where we often find ourselves in situations where the government has essentially said, that's not okay, and either we're going to be secular France and say, we don't believe things here, so we're going to suppress any religious identity. So we can't have those conversations in a way that is productive for the society, that actually builds a democratic values.
And I'll just add to that if you're comfortable with what you believe in theory, not necessarily always in practice, then it makes you more able to let go. And I think there's something very important about letting go and learning how to do that, in the sense of you don't have to convince the other person to take your position or your view. If you feel comfortable with who you are and what you believe, then you can let go, because there are other more important things. If you're a believer in at least the monotheistic religions, or at least some of them, there's a next life. So you don't have to freak out about every little thing here and whether someone's angry at you or disagrees with you, because God expands what's possible. Where it is unfortunate, though, in practice, because we're talking in theory here, but of course we're all familiar with religious people who don't act this way and have a lot of trouble letting go. So it's also religious people themselves who have to do a lot of work to actually live up to these ideals, because I would argue, if they are truly at peace and they believe in God and they're comfortable with their belief, then they don't have to be so aggressive and intense and sometimes disrespectful or even intolerant about it. So, but obviously there's a theory-practice gap here.
Yeah, and just an important thing as a theologian, the Bible does not say go convert people. The Bible says go witness, tell the story. And so it's not on Christians to go out and convert people, but to be a witness, to tell that story. And that's a critical thing that often Christians miss. They feel as if saving people is their responsibility rather than God's. And so I'm a member of a denomination of Christianity, Reformed denomination, which says God actually changes people's minds, not human beings. So that enables, as Shadi was saying, people to relax a little bit.
This crowd of people
Questions?
is asking remarkable questions,
Yeah,
so I want to make
we'll
sure
go
we get to
quicker.
some of
Yeah,
these.
we'll do it quickly.
I'm so kind as a moderator, right?
Interrupt us.
What are the limits of pluralism? So good on you. You know there's limits, right? What are the limits? Is there some amount of shared cultural consensus needed to make a common life together?
There has to be something that we share. I tend to see that as being relatively basic and procedural. So for Americans or people or residents of this country, that the thing that we share is, at least in theory, is respect for the democratic process. That if the other party wins and we don't like the other party, then we find a way to live with it, and vice versa, because with two parties, it's probably going to alternate quite a bit. So if you have people who don't believe in the democratic process, then you have a problem, because then there's no way to resolve conflicts over fundamental beliefs. Because if one side, let's say you have someone who's basically theocratic and believes that there should be either a Christian theocracy or an Islamic theocracy or some kind of dictatorship in America, then that doesn't allow for pluralism. The starting premise has to be that we're a free democratic society, and that ultimately democracy is what regulates who has the power instead of imposing power. And so one concern I have, especially with the upcoming election, is on both sides. There's concerns that if Trump loses, is he going to accept the outcome right away, or will he cause some kind of disturbance or bring his people out for a rally or whatever? On the other hand, I worry that if the Democratic candidate loses and Trump is reelected, that more and more Democrats will say, this is 100% illegitimate. Trump shouldn't have been president the first time. He definitely should have been president the second time. The Electoral College is illegitimate. So we are getting to a point where this can be an issue, and that's why I think there has to be at least some shared understanding that there is a process that we sign up for as Americans, because without that, we don't really have a whole lot. So for me, it's somewhat minimalist. I don't think there's a lot else we have to agree on, because agreement is not the goal of democracy, sort of for the reasons that we're talking about. The goal of democracy is to give people the ability to share who they are and what they believe, and to organize and protest and vote the way they see fit, even if the rest of us don't like it.
Yeah, so I think the two of us are very minimalistic. So skinheads being able to have an organization, I think it's really basically law keeping is sort of the minimum bar. The political philosopher and theologian Abraham Kuyper, who I really enjoy, talks about, as far as the limits of religious freedoms, there's two basic limits that the state needs to impose on religions. The first is protecting other religions from that religion. So if one religion is dominating another in a destructive and violent way, the state has a responsibility to protect the other religions and ideologies. The second is what he says, protecting the weak ones. So if there are children or women or poor people who are being oppressed or injured in some way, the state has a responsibility to defend them, to go into the religion and defend those. And then, of course, there's all kinds of wonderful questions about how do you define all of those things, and you can read the book. But we'll keep going.
It may generate more questions.
Yeah.
Could you say something about whether or not the respect required for pluralistic discussions actually requires sort of an a priori shared foundational ethic? So essentially the person is asking, is true pluralism even possible?
Yeah, I think it's only possible if you accept that there are no final victories in this world, in this life. That's a starting premise that you have to sign on to. If you believe that there has to be some utopian striving and a definitive victory because in this life, because maybe this is the only life we have, and therefore what you do here takes on a very heightened importance. That can sometimes be the perspective of some people. So some people aren't going to want to compromise, and they're going to want to go all the way because, so, but if we start and we say, hey, again, this idea of a built-in humility about what is possible to know because we're flawed as human beings, and you don't even need to be a religious person to know that, because everyone knows that they are flawed, and if you take the whole span of your life, however old or young you are, you know that you've changed your positions on important issues over time. If I look at the things that I thought 5 years ago or 10 years ago that I changed my mind on, we all know that we change and we're flawed and all that. But not everyone is going to buy into that. And then, so my approach, if I meet someone like that, I'm like, hey, I'm not sure if this is the best use of our time to engage in this discussion because we don't share that very basic premise. So you can't always have a fruitful discussion. And I think a very important thing is to learn when to step back and to step away and not to engage, because there's no point in engaging. It becomes an endless circular thing where neither person is going to learn from the other. And I've learned this the hard way on Twitter, which is a very good testing ground for your patience and your tolerance for endless frustration. But you learn, because there's a lot of trolls on Twitter who obviously don't care about the truth. They just want to attack and undermine and gaslight. And I've learned that when you see people like that, you don't even respond, because once you you guys know, feeding the troll, trolls are not supposed to be fed.
Yeah, I don't think America needs a shared ethic. I think we need ethical communities. So, and that those ethical communities can differ in a variety of ways, but we need citizens who have resources to cultivate their own humility, to be people of love and grace and generosity, but they're going to have different language for those things, and they're going to look unique. And I think the United States, or really any country, can tolerate and can go on with hate groups within it, as long as they have other communities that are more generous. So there needs to be a bit of a critical mass of generous communities and generous ethics in order for a healthy democracy to exist. But I'm less interested in us cultivating a sort of bland American ethic that we all sign on to, as cultivating a variety of religious communities that are working on these questions themselves. Because I don't think a bland ethic is something that you're willing to, that can hold up when things get difficult.
Yes. Could you, both of you mentioned, kind of the work in other countries and some of the ways that evangelicals and Muslims have maybe found themselves in relationship with one another. Could you talk a little bit about the connections that these groups share in dominant secular societies? I mean, what has that looked like? I think some folks are sort of wondering, what are the features of those types of communities?
So I think one commonality is being strange. And there's a whole, and even this kind of language is used in Islamic texts, the idea of, when religion is lost, the people who keep faith, they are strangers. I assume there's something comparable, in Christianity, maybe not the exact same kinds of descriptions, but the basic idea is there. And I feel like my Christian friends here in America, even though America is still relatively more religious than much of Western Europe, they feel increasingly like they are strangers in their own country, especially if they live in major cities, for example. So this idea that there's an overarching secular culture that is so dominant and has basically won the culture war, that people who hold on to religion and act religiously in the public sphere are perceived quite literally as being strange, weird. And you've probably been in conversations where I've been, so, I mean, again, like I'm not the most conservative person, but, you know, I believe, and even just believing is perceived by some of my friends as weird. I remember a conversation I had with actually some of my best friends, a very late night conversation. We were covering all kinds of issues, God, and you know, and I hadn't talked to them that much about the afterlife specifically. They knew that I'm a believer, but I said something about like heaven and hell, and one of my close friends was like, Shadi, I know that you've said that before, that you believe in an afterlife, but you're so smart and brilliant, you don't really believe that there's such thing as an afterlife. And I was like, thank you for thinking that I'm so intelligent and brilliant and all of that. But there was something interesting about that kind of exchange, that she couldn't really believe that I could really believe. So this is just all to say that even on relatively basic things, at least in Christianity and in Islam, the idea that there's something after this life, you can be seen as weird. I can get away with it a little bit more because, you know, I'm a minority, I'm a person of color, so, you know, people are always, at least liberals are going to be nicer to me because they don't want to offend a person of color, all that stuff, you know, whatever. You know, if you're a white guy who's talking about, like...
They'll smash on me.
Hey, let's be straight up. Like, if you're a white guy talking about, like, Christianity, afterlife, and Christ, like, people are going to be like, that guy's really weird.
So yeah, the strangeness. In the New Testament, we talk about the gospel being a scandal, like a stumbling block. And I wrote this article about the hijab, the headscarf, and how I, as a Christian, I live in Houston, one of the most diverse cities in America, massive Muslim population, and you know, I regularly pass women with the hijab in my grocery store. And I wrote this article just reflecting on the headscarf as a gift to democracy, and in that the strangeness of it causes other democratic citizens to reflect on their own strangeness and to be aware that we are not all the same and having to reflect on those kinds of questions. So for me as a Christian, the presence of the hijab in my neighborhood, in my school, in my children's school, these sorts of things cause me to reflect as a Christian, am I willing to be strange? What strangeness is God calling me to? Have I been faithful to that? And am I willing to make space for others who are strange to me? And so I see that as a gift, and it's something I'm thankful for. And so I think, I agree with Shadi that the strangeness can be a point of contact. It's not so much that it's not that we believe the same thing, but the shared experience of being odd. Yeah.
Thank you. This is going to be our last question. But, you know, I'm aware that some people have come to listen in from the community, but a lot of the folks who are here are students. So what advice would you give to students to kind of practice sort of the principled pluralism that we've talked about, practice the civic friendship that we've talked about, yeah, in a time of really deep division, right? Their formative experience is one of incredible division. Which is slightly different than, you know, where we started our conversation with the things that were formative in your stories. What advice would you give to them?
Well, I'll just speak to the Christian students. I would say, so I wrote this book about Christian hospitality towards Muslims, being a host, but I'd like to reverse that for a moment and say, learn how to be a guest. Learn how to show up with someone who is different from you, who is not a Christian, who's not of your race, and learn how to ask questions and be curious, and just sit there and be quiet and listen. So I think I would say that. Learn how to be a guest. Learn how to sit at someone else's table. Learn how to sort of experience that discomfort and enjoy the fruits that come from that.
So whenever I get questions about advice to students, first of all, it makes me feel a little bit old. I mean, I am still relatively young in the broader scheme of things, I suppose. But I also feel weird, like, playing that role of, yeah, this is what having been through everything you've been through at that time of my life, here, if only I could do it over, this is what I would have done differently, like that sort of, whatever. But I guess I'll do a little bit of that. Because I do look back at that time in my life with mixed feelings, and I think there are things I don't like about how I was when I was younger, and I think that this happens quite a lot at a particular age, that you've read some new book or some new author and you feel like you're getting closer to like the truth, and you're excited and passionate, energetic, and that can lead to a kind of dogmatism. And I feel like I wasn't always a great listener. I was just waiting to kind of offer my own opinion, argue, and I was aggressive and all that. Maybe there's no way to really like change overnight, but just be aware sometimes. Just be self-aware. So it's interesting that even old people can be very unself-aware, as we know from our own politicians. And very intelligent people can be very unself-aware. They're oblivious to how silly they might seem or how closed-minded they might seem. I think always one of the most important traits in life to hold throughout your life is to really be a somewhat inward thinker. Not all the time, but at least some of the time, where you're reflecting on how you appear to other people, not in a kind of status symbol kind of way, but how are you being a dick a lot of the time? You don't be.
That's good advice.
Don't be a dick. Yeah. But I would also say, but a more specific thing that this maybe would apply more to Muslim students. I think sometimes, this is my own experience being in the Muslim minority and being in the MSA, Muslim Student Association at Georgetown at that time in my life, I expected that the majority should learn about my religion, that they were the ones who should come to me and learn about Islam. And at that time, I didn't reciprocate. I didn't have an interest in learning about Christianity. As I mentioned earlier, that came later in my life where I got interested in Christianity. And I think that in the community that I grew up in, which is just like a normal Muslim community in Pennsylvania, we weren't really encouraged to learn a lot about Christianity. And I think that the only way this works is if there's some reciprocity. So, if you're a Muslim student, and presumably you're strong enough in your own beliefs, you don't have to be particularly practicing or whatever, but if you believe in Islam, you should feel comfortable to learn about other religions and not feel threatened by them. And I think that it's important to also, especially if your Christian neighbors are seeking you out of hospitality and wanting to learn more about your community and your faith, that it has to be a two-way street. And that means being open to concepts and ideas in Christianity and to learn about them and appreciate them, even though you might have grown up in a context where those were seen as problematic ideas or corrupted ideas, or they're not true to God. All these things that sometimes you hear at an earlier age, and that can sometimes be challenging if you've always heard that the idea of the Trinity, that's really wrong and bad and all of that. And we don't even want to engage with conversations about the Trinity. No. I think the Trinity is complicated for Muslims to understand, but that only makes it it makes it a richer experience. And that's what I've found. I still don't understand the Trinity, but I really didn't understand it like 20 years ago. And I think that I like hearing about it. I like hearing Christians describe it to me, because it feels in some sense strange, but strange in a good way, and I learn from strangeness.
I want to just thank you for sharing. I think something really important that has been talked about here is both the depth of one's own knowledge and understanding, and a recognition at the outset that we don't all agree, and that the goal in a democracy is not to make us all agree, right? To come together in some fake, here's how we all see it the same way, because we don't. There is this deep respect for other religious traditions, right? And so part of it is kind of a sequence, right, of suspending this idea that we're going to make everyone come down to this one plain thing. Bland was your word, right? But instead come to a place where we know ourselves, we know people who are not like us, and we understand their traditions. And then what does that mean for our life together in a democracy, right? And things we've talked about tonight are things about protection and respect, about mutual care, and about an opportunity to continue to live fully in communities that are generous and hospitable, that are different and might be strange inside a larger secular culture. So thank you for sharing what you've shared tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we'd be happy to stick around and answer a few more once we're finished. So thank you.